Mark Van Steenwyk. He uses he, him pronouns. He has spoken with Spirit a number of times already this year, and we loved him so much we wanted to bring him back again. He is the director of the Center for Prophetic Imagination in Minneapolis. They are leading the charge with reform in spirituality. They're doing really great work over there. And Mark has a lot of personal connections to not only spirituality, but also to Black Lives Matter racial justice work right now in the Twin Cities. So he is here to talk to us about what police reform looks like. The purpose behind having this program today is because police reform is obviously on everybody's mind right now, and it's a really big issue to try and unpack. So rather than trying to do it by ourselves, we'll have one source that we get to hear from to try and understand the continuum a little better. After he's done presenting all of the information, we'll have hopefully a very lively discussion. So that'll be an opportunity to ask questions and have a discussion about what has been said and what we're all thinking. So this program is budgeted to go till 8 p.m. However, we have the room until 8:30. So if the discussion is just really going, we're welcome to stay on longer. So with that, Mark, please take it away. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me again. I'm going to attempt to share my screen here. Can everyone see that okay? Okay, good. Just to start off, I'll make just introduce myself a little bit more with these connections that were mentioned about how I'm coming at this, and some disclaimers. Like the disclaimer piece is once you start talking about policing and the criminal justice system, which I'm going to introduce in a different way of talking about that same thing, it gets it's complex. I mean, there's a reason that criminology is a PhD program. I have never studied any of this stuff at that level. And so I'm going to be giving mostly a history lesson and then bringing us up to today and then talking about how we could look at reform movements inspired by our spiritual commitments. And it's that spirituality piece that's really, normally I lean heavily into that, although I'll mostly end with that because I want to really tell the story about policing in America as a backdrop, because I find that we often assume we know what policing is, and it's more complicated than we often think. Another disclaimer is I'm coming at this largely as a police abolitionist. I don't think the police should generally exist in our just society, but I'm going to try to not be like overbearing with that position and try to show that there's a spectrum of people who have desires to see things change that aren't all police abolitionists like me. My personal connections, besides just kind of showing up and doing the protesty stuff, the Center for Prophetic Imagination, several people who are on our board or who have been on our board serve with MPD 150 or Reclaim the Block or the Black Visions Collective, which are three of the groups in the Twin Cities that have been most prominent in calling for a defunding of the police, and including that push to, they've been doing this work for a while, pushing towards like, let's just remove policing from the city charter and start over with a public health model that may include policing as an aspect of that, to reframe this discussion. So, so I have lots of friends who have been involved in this work, and personally my involvement has been more, not in the front and center, but supportive as a friend and an advocate for that work. And to show up when stuff gets protesty, I guess. But I want to start by talking about, we talk about policing, we talk about criminal justice, and there's a term that this definition comes mostly out of Berkeley, the carceral system. It seems like a needlessly complicated term, and then if you type the word carceral into your Word document, it'll get the red squiggly line under it, because it'll say that's not really a word, but you could say the word, it is a word. Okay, because the term carceral system is more accurate, because criminal justice, the criminal justice system not everyone who commits a crime gets exposed to the system. We see this all the time with the more power you have, the less likely you are to enter the criminal justice system, no matter how much criminality you have. And then also, justice isn't something that a lot of people actually ever find in the criminal justice system. So it's just kind of a gloss to say the term criminal justice points to this idea that we get the bad guys and bring justice to society, and that's not how it's experienced. It's also good to talk about the carceral system, because it is everything from how legislation works, the laws that have been passed before, the court systems, policing, incarceration, to even how nonprofits and hospitals work with the police towards criminalizing and responding to certain behaviors rather than other ones, creates this network that scholars are beginning to call the carceral system. Okay, so this is a definition that I think is very helpful. The carceral system is understood as a comprehensive network of systems that rely on the exercise of state-sanctioned physical, so like they can hurt you, emotional, they can traumatize you, spatial, meaning they can contain you and tell you where to be and imprison you, economic, and political violence to preserve the interests of the state and therefore the powerful. So I'm going to be talking about this as a system, because if we only talk about policing as the stuff we see on the street and try to reform that, then we have a problem, because it's a complex system. And reform measures, as we're going to see, tend to focus on the very end of it, the tip of the spear, as it were, rather than the driving force behind the spear. And so that's why I'm spending more time giving a history lesson than I would normally otherwise do. So the history, policing, I mean, in some way, as long as there's been civilization, there's been something like policing, but what we think of as policing in America is relatively new. And its roots, if we want to look at the history of it, the roots of it begin with volunteer groups called, came as the Night Watch. This is what they're called. In colonial America, you had volunteers standing watch at night, and they realized pretty quickly this didn't work, because people didn't want to do it. And usually the people you find to do the night watch are actually criminals, which is ironic, people that are being punished. So you have to stay up and watch the frontier or watch for shady activity. And they also found that because they didn't want to be there, they would sleep and drink and eat all night long and not do anything. And so eventually they realized we need to have a more of a professional way of doing this. And so here's a picture of early night watch, just wandering around. Town criers is also kind of part of that same kind of methodology and history of people who stand guard and watch and alert people to things. The first municipally funded police force was in 1658 in Boston. It wasn't big. And even then, it's still not professionalized. You just had a handful of people whose job was to do the night watch. They largely didn't have jails, and in fact, one of the early reforms around prison and policing came from, one of the first prisons in the United States was from the Quakers. You don't think of those peaceful folk as being the first prison, because they thought people being alone, even in solitary confinement, to read the Bible and repent would be a good idea, and so that's why it's called a penitentiary. So these prisons weren't common before this. In this time still, during the municipally funded police force, you get caught, you'd be corporally punished. You weren't usually held in jail. And these police officers there weren't many, and they didn't really have a very organized presence. It really starts to organize with slavery. In 1701, or 1704, you have slave patrols officially emerge to prevent rebellion and escape from enslaved people. So 1704 was in the Carolinas, and they were the core of Southern policing. That's a story we don't usually tell, but organized law enforcement in the South begins with slave patrols. And it's important to remember that, because it's not like that went away with the end of slavery. Okay, so you had these groups, and they were kind of mean guys going around rounding people up, and they'd keep their eye out on for other things that were happening in civil disorder, but their big concern in the South for property and disruption were enslaved peoples. After the Civil War, these slave patrollers were the core of police forces. So as they started developing their own Reconstruction era police force, a significant number of them had been slave patrollers. And then, this is pretty common knowledge at this point, but a lot of Southern police officers and a disturbing number of Northern police officers were involved with the KKK. There's this continuation of that. And more in the Northern lands here, you see policing really develop in the 19th century as a response to immigration and unions. Now, this isn't an anomaly, because like looking back to 1658 in Boston, the reason that policing happened was before, and even during most of this time, if you needed policing, you had to pay for it yourself. And so what we think of as policing were security forces that were hired by wealthy people to protect their goods and their services. And so even in 1658 Boston, there were private policing before, and they just realized, it's in the common interest to have our stuff guarded by taxpayer money. So it was a way of passing the bill to the public. And so you see this in the 19th century with the rise of industrialism. You have police forces largely emerge as a way of protecting property, because industry, like there's a lot of wealth concentrated in cities, and also to keep workers in line, and also to respond to this scary new group of people that were immigrating from Europe. Like, you had a bunch of Catholics coming in, Irish Catholics, you had Germans, Eastern Europeans, Italians. And these were nice Scandinavian folk who didn't like any of these other types of immigrants, Protestant Scandinavian folks. And so there was this fear. And so this fear and this desire to keep unions in line was where you started to see this growth of a desire for unions. And one of the biggest police presences before public policing really caught on and professionalized were the Pinkertons. So anyone who knows their history about the Pinkertons, they were the ones called in to bust up unions. So there's all sorts of coal mining massacres that happened against union folks that were led by the Pinkertons. Now, it'd be a mistake just to assume that these were just merely private companies like the Pinkertons being hired by industrialists like Carnegie. When the Department of Justice was formed, they needed to have a enforcement arm. And so in what year was that? In 1871, Congress hired the Pinkertons to serve as the Department of Justice law enforcement officers. So this line between union busting private agencies, slave patrols to modern policing is almost entirely seamless. The thing that shifts is who begins to pay for it. So it's interesting, like we like the idea, I tend to like the idea of things being publicly run instead of privately held. But in this case, it's the private accountability stuck. So in other words, even though we as the people are paying through taxation, they're not exactly accountable to us. That takes a while. And this is where reform movements come in. Reform movements have existed as long as there's been policing and there's been incarceration. And it's really an effort to get public control over these carceral systems, often in ways that backfire. For the history context, Minneapolis Police Department started in 1867 with 4 police officers. And so this is only just years after the Dred Scott case, and just only a handful, like 8 years maybe after the Dakota 38 were executed after the Dakota War. So this is in the thick of that sort of turmoil. Not that long, like after the Civil War, we had our first police department. Here you have a picture of union busters coming to stand up against the workers. And so when we talk about policing, what we think of as professional policing, where it's a job that you start maybe when you're young and you retire when you're old, that idea of it being a career didn't emerge in the United States until the 1900s. And it was also during that time, and I could go off on this for a while, but they started their own union and they were part of the AFL. And they had to choose early on whether or not they were going to be part in solidarity with other union people or not. And so early on, pressure was put on police officers to separate. And so this is why the only union that is acceptable for union-loving people to dislike are police unions. It's because they've always been their own separate thing since the early 1900s. Okay. Keeping on with the history lesson. In this next piece, there's a great documentary on Netflix called 13th. If you haven't seen it, I encourage you to check it out. And this is where things get interesting, like and sneaky. So the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution abolishes slavery, which is good, but it leaves a loophole in there that, well, if you're a free person, so if you're incarcerated, if you're in jail, you can still be exploited for free labor. And so that creates this incentive to criminalize behaviors. And so early on, this is kind of what the Jim Crow era is halfway about, is people using power to keep Black persons under the thumb through scare tactic, legalized bullying, and even high incarceration rates, because then you can still treat them like slaves. This intensifies, though, when we see the war on crime and the era of mass incarceration. And this is interesting. This is an example of white backlash. So white backlash is this phenomenon that happens whenever Black people in particular, but people in color in general, get any power. There's almost always this hugely regressive white backlash that in some ways makes things worse than they were before. So you saw this with Reconstruction after the Civil War. So even though you had this surge of like Black Congress people and the creation of Black wealth, a lot of it got rolled back during Reconstruction, and some things got worse during Reconstruction, especially in the North. We also see a white backlash during and after the Civil Rights era, and this is what we see with the war on crime and the war on drugs. So like, and it started by the same guy, like, so LBJ, who a lot of liberals tend to like him because he tried to work with MLK, but he also had his great push again on the war of poverty, on poverty. So in 1965, LBJ employed local policing as his quote unquote frontline soldiers in his war on poverty and crime, which he linked together. And I'm sure he meant well, like you know, if you're going to try to end poverty, you have to crack down on criminal elements, was his thinking. And so we think of this as modern, but he spent the equivalent of $223 million to militarize the police. Police helicopters, tanks, that all started under LBJ as a way of upping the ante. Before then, the idea of the federal government directly getting involved in local policing wasn't really as much of a thing. So LBJ pushed this. Now, I don't think he enacted policies that contributed so massively to mass incarceration. That came later, but he set this precedent for militarized policing and really continuing with this false notion that poverty, that crime causes poverty more than poverty causes crime. It's just it's like a conservative liberal divide, chicken or egg situation. And LBJ kind of went after the criminality as a way of addressing poverty, which I think was a mistake. In 1971, Nixon began his war on drugs, which, you know, we all know that Nixon was a bastard, but he started his war on drugs. And we later found out, you know, this has been on the news, it's referenced a lot, that John Ehrlichman, who is Nixon's domestic policy chief, later explained that the war on drugs was just effectively a war against Black power and anti-war movements. So if you wanted to get at Black power and you wanted to get at anti-war stuff, you know, one thing those two groups have in common is they like their drugs. So we're going to have a war on drugs as a way of undermining their power. This has been corroborated since. But this language of being hard on crime and hard on drugs really plays well to conservatives and continues to this day. And so today, even though this is true, he did it, like most incarcerations are for non-violent acts, like drug things, but not even just drug stuff. If you include local prisons, most incarceration happens for things that are even borderline not illegal. And I'm going to share personal story about that in a moment. First, I want to show these charts. So you can see this chart of incarceration rates. You see it begin to go up in the 70s. It really starts spiking here in 1984 when our favorite president was in office, Ronald Reagan. There was a couple of laws that were passed, the Sentencing Reform Act, yes, right, in 1984, and then late 1987 there was a second act. I think it was just called the Sentencing Act, and both were to try to standardize federal sentencing in a way that almost sounded like it was to make things a little bit more humane, but it had the opposite effect. Surprise, surprise. And so incarceration rates spiked. And so you see this trajectory as a white backlash, criminalizing drug use and leaning into that, and creating this system that where, according to who you ask, so like the Prison Policy Initiative, and I'll send a link to this afterwards. They said that 25% of the daily jail population are in for misdemeanors like jaywalking or sitting on a sidewalk, not even drug use, like the low stuff. And here's my personal story about that. It's like 6, 7, 8 years ago. Some friends and I were arrested for wiping fake blood on the federal courthouse to protest drone warfare. And so I was arrested. I feel like me and the one other guy were the only ones who really should have been in there. I was in this holding cell for like 10 hours. It was very cramped. I have all sorts of stories about that. The worst part of it in my mind just is an interesting story. They give you bologna sandwiches that are abnormally thick. Like it's a kind of bologna you can't buy in the store. For some reason, jails have it. And it's just, there's nothing on it besides bologna and bread and then an apple. They give you those things. And a man came in who was diabetic and because he was arrested away from his medication, he was having a rough go of it. And the police guards, the prison guards, were not willing to give him, the jail guards were not willing to give him his apple and bread because he came a half hour too late. And all these prisoners people that were jailed were saying, no, we know it's down the hall in that office there, just go get it. And they wouldn't. And so this man went, some of the other people in the jail had, maybe because they just grew up not liking the crust, had ripped the crust off of their sandwiches. And so the crust parts of bread were sitting on the floor. And so this man went to the ground and started eating the crust off of the floor. And to me, everyone there was just sad about this, and the guards came in and they started laughing. So then I started asking why he was there. He was there because he had fallen asleep on a bus, and after the bus was pulled into its garage, he was still in, and so they found him there inside of the place as a trespasser. So this homeless man was arrested for trespassing and falling asleep on a bus. I started asking everyone else why they were there, and it was all like getting caught with like a misdemeanor level of pot, refusing to answer questions when they were asked, all these sorts of little things. Every single one of them was there for a $50 bail, so that's the only reason, like $50 level worth of offense, except for one guy who was there for a DWI, who was from the suburbs. He was a very affluent person, and he was the only one loudly complaining about being in jail. So to me, that's an anecdote. But my sense and what I've heard is jails are usually filled with people like this. We hear on the news all the stories about like extreme criminality and violence. And so when we're told about police reform, we get afraid because we think most of the work they do is responding to violent, threatening situations, when in all reality, it's small things. It's the mundane tasks. Continuing on. So when we talk about reforming the police, there's 3 different approaches that are put out especially in the Twin Cities now, in our discourse. We talk about reform. Reform movements generally accept the need for modern policing, mostly as is, but they recognize that there are some problems. They recognize serious problems, depending on your level of reforms you want. Attempts at reform are usually aimed at lowering the lethality of police, so disarming them at some level. That's one way that reforms tend to go. Another is to limit what they can legally do, so making it illegal to chokehold, or limiting the number of circumstances in which it's okay to pull a gun. So limiting lethality, that's one area. The second area is to increase accountability. So this is where we get civilian oversight, body cams, community policing, external investigations. It's a way of making sure the police are accountable to us, the people, rather than to political operators or to the police union or whoever, but that we should be the ones to supervise them and hold them accountable at some level. And then the third one are attempts at training and screenings. This is kind of the bad cop scenario, like, well, bad situations are caused by bad apples. So we are going to have better training, better screening. We're going to do mental health screening, diversity training, de-escalation techniques. The reform efforts have existed for as long as policing, to varying degrees of success. So we have an example. One of the biggest efforts right now nationally is the 8 Can't Wait. And so these are examples of, these are considered very progressive reform efforts, many of which Minneapolis has already done. One is ban chokeholds and strangleholds. I mean, all these are good things, by the way, but it's interesting, like, that these are considered fairly drastic within public discourse until recently. Second, require de-escalation. So before it wasn't required. Require warning before shooting. Exhaust all alternatives before shooting. Duty to intervene, which is what the fellow officers for Derek Chauvin should have done, intervened. Ban shooting at moving vehicles. Establish use of force continuum, where you have a clearly documented escalation practice and continuum of force, and then require all force be reported. So these, there's been all sorts of debates over whether or not this is true, that the people with 8 Can't Wait believe that these 8 policies could decrease police violence by 72%. I don't know how that can be verified or not. And the fact that these 8 things are still things that need to be done is astonishing if you think about it, because they all seem very common sense. But this is, you can understand, even if you're a reformist at heart, you can understand, like, fighting for these small pieces gets hard. And so, like, this is where it leads to this next thing, is defunding, which is neither an abolition nor a reform. It could go either way depending on how you look at it. Defunding the police department, as long as I've been looking at it, has never been taken seriously at all until the last month or so. It's astonishing, and I'm hopeful, but I'm also guarded that we could actually get traction on this. And this is the idea. So when you hear someone say we need to defund the police, it doesn't mean we're going to cut all the money and just, like, leave them with 6 police officers. It means it's a strategy that recognizes that the police are the only agency being tasked with responding to a vast array of problems. That shouldn't be the job of police. So you want to have a wellness check on your grandmother, police do it. If you want, if your cousin Edgar is having a mental health crisis, the police are brought in. All sorts of things, like not only just responding to violent things, like settling disputes between landlords and tenants. One of my activities I like to do is go to the Nextdoor app, which is a social media site for people who are neighbors, and it can be terrifying to read that sometimes because there's a lot of fear that comes out. And one of the things I was reading is this landlord who had evicted one of their tenants and claimed that they weren't holding any of their stuff, but confessed in the conversation chain that they were holding their tenant's mail, which is a federal offense, by the way. And they were calling the police repeatedly to get the police to come and get their tenant out of there. And so as this conversation unfolded, it really became clear, like, this is really, like, the police get called in on anything that is settling a dispute, a conflict, anything that is seen as a nuisance. Your neighbor has loud music, the dogs are too loud, all kinds of things that have, like, almost the definition of policing is the people you call that have a gun. and are legally allowed to use it. The fact that we call them for all these things sets them up for trouble. So at the very least, we should say, from a defunding perspective, let's see, what are those things that really the police shouldn't do, that you don't want to call the person with a gun to do? Let's take that part of their budget, percentage-wise, and redirect that to existing or new agencies that are better equipped to deal with landlord-tenant disputes, dealing with noise nuisances, mental health checks, wellness checks, all the things. That's what defunding is. And the fact that even that is controversial is astonishing, because we all recognize the police do too many tasks. Which is why, by the way, every reformist measure tends to, almost without exception, every reformist measure ends up with the police having a larger budget, which is where it backfires, because they get more money because we're trying to do that to give them more latitude, more freedom to not feel overwhelmed. But they're not accountable to us, so they get to use the money how they see fit, and so they re-entrench. Paying for more money for body cams, they don't use it for body cams. They turn it off and they use the money for other things. That happens a lot. So finally, this third perspective, which is the abolition. Abolitionists want to entirely get rid of modern policing, to replace it. So they start with this defunding tactic, but go deeper by recognizing that policing is trying to address the symptoms of deeper issues. So if crime is caused, which I think it largely is caused by poverty, and a certain set of like addiction can contribute to criminality, all sorts of things. I'm talking about the criminality that the police enforce. The stuff like Roger Stone and Bernie Madoff, those sorts of criminals, the police doesn't really exist for them. The stuff that the police actually show up for, those things are caused, we can kind of track and see what causes them. So instead of like dealing with the symptom, let's deal with the cause. That's the abolitionist logic. So abolitionists want to spend money on housing, food, education, mental health, conflict resolution, and more. Fund these agencies that need to exist, and then even go further. And so the abolition movement it isn't just about policing. It's in some ways, ironically, a gateway drug to more radical measures in society at large. It recognizes that a society that spends so much on military and police to deal with problems that are whose roots are much deeper and more problematic than that is a fundamentally sick society, and we need to rethink it all. So here we have the response to the 8 Can't Wait is the 8 to Abolition, which is a counter movement to the first one. And so these are the 8 principles that they push for: is 1, defund the police; 2, demilitarize communities. So not only redistribute funding elsewhere, but take away their arsenals. 3, remove police from schools, which we've seen that discussed in Minneapolis. 4, free people from jails and prisons, especially given that most people in jail and prison are not there for violent offenses. The vast majority are not. And even the ones that are, maybe there's a better way of dealing with them than just locking them up and throwing away the key. It's the violent ones that are always raise the question of, well, we can't really get rid of all of this. I understand the complexity of that. 5, repeal laws that criminalize survival. And what that means is we shouldn't criminalize sex trade. Selling drugs or any kind of street economy shouldn't be something that's punished with the police and through incarceration. 6, invest in community self-governance, which means lean into the idea that we as municipalities, neighborhoods, cities should have more say over how we do things. And we're seeing this right now with this argument about redoing the charter. Who really has the say over what Minneapolis does? Like everyone, including Donald Trump, is weighing on it, but it should be up to us. 7, provide safe housing for everyone, because that gets rid of a lot of the things we can criminalize now if people have a house. And then 8, invest in care, not cops. Okay, and I'm gonna just end here, but before I move on to this last piece, if there's any clarification questions that people have about that. We're going to have time to discuss, but before I move on to the Jesus-y stuff, I want to pause and see if there's any questions about anything I've already shared. And I covered a lot. You could read about 100 books about all of that stuff I just shared. I'm not hearing anything or seeing anything, so I'm going to just keep going until we're done. This question of like, okay, well, how does our spirituality fit into this?
You know what? I have one thing.
Okay, great.
I wanted to ask, and not to get too off track, but the one thing I think about when we remove guns, how is there a plan to remove guns from all the citizens that are carrying around, you know, extremely dangerous guns too? Like, how is that always a part of it? Because I always think of that. There's a lot of armed non-police out there. How do you address that on a scale?
I mean, that's a great question, because I mean, if we think about societies that do not have, like in the UK, there are police officers who have guns, but that's an extreme minority of law enforcement. Most, you know, don't. But they also have a society where most regular citizens aren't armed. And so I do think the two are linked. I'm not sure. Part of my question is like, I'm not sure if you take the guns away from the police, if you're going to see an uptick in other gun violence or not. I mean, that's something that I think is worth exploring, because to me, in my mind, police officers are still an example of the good guys with guns phenomenon that we use all the time to justify why regular citizens should be armed, because criminal elements are illegally armed. And so it's kind of this, in some way, it's elephants all the way down. But I do think that the societies that have successfully limited the lethality of the police also don't have armed populace. And I do think it's part of the larger question of the sickness of American culture.
There's a quick question in the chat. Mark, is there any democracy that has defunded the police?
You know, that's a good question. Not to the extent, like, if I start thinking about what we will end up with, what we're going to end up with, likely, even if we have everything we want and it's diminished, it's going to look an awful lot like these societies. So even though I personally would love to move beyond even the defunding model to full-on abolition, most societies that we think of that have, like Iceland, their police department looks an awful lot like this sort of the goal that the defunding movement is talking about. So in a way, yes, there are six, but they never had to defund. They just never started with the same assumptions, or at least I'm not aware of mass reforms. I think there's something unique about those societies that have a militaristic police force.
Right, thank you.
But it raises the whole historic, like, I would love to have my historian friends and my people who study international political science. I'd love to know what they would say about that.
I have one question.
Mm-hmm.
Do a lot of the people that talk about defund the police or reform link it to prison issues, like what you were talking about as far as all these people in jail without $50 bail money? I mean, are they talked about together usually?
Yeah, to me, the police abolition movement, which was almost unheard of until a few months ago, came out, like, so MPD 150, a lot of those folks, they were all prison abolitionists. So, you know, if you look on Amazon for books on prison abolition, you find a lot, but there's like one book on police abolition by Alex Vitale, right? And so, but the prison abolition movement, or the police abolition movement, is in a way an outgrowth of that, because it recognizes that it's an entire carceral system. So people have talked about abolishing the police, but that's been a conversation that you're more likely to have among the Black Panther Party and groups like that, where have been in the radical edge for a long time. It's only now breaking into public consciousness, and those two things are very much linked. But it's interesting though, like the prison abolition conversation has never assumed that police abolition has to happen, whereas police abolitionists almost always talk about prison abolition as having to happen. So to me, it's in some ways a radicalization or an intensification of the prison abolition argument. Yeah. And I'm looking forward to get, like, you know, we've had the books about the problem with prisons and incarceration. I'm looking forward to the wealth of knowledge and research that's going to come out now that more people are thinking about this. I'm assuming we're going to have some obstacles ahead, and we have a fascist government right now. But even just starting to think about this gives me hope that we can start being creative and thinking of better ways of managing ourselves as a society. Which segues me to Jesus here. Like, it's hard to talk about Jesus when you're talking about police, because we're all conditioned at some level to think about Jesus as having nothing to do with politics. And so even this passage, which, you know, these are just basically a handful of touch points for us to think about, well, what might be a Jesus-shaped way of looking at this, is when Jesus went to his hometown in Nazareth and read from the Isaiah scroll and upset all of his neighbors, he said to them, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." I've heard probably 6 or 7 sermons on this passage before. I'm not counting the ones I've given. And never do they think it has to do with anybody who's actually kept imprisoned, that they're going to be set free. Maybe the poor. We like caring about the poor, but it's usually spiritualized. Now, most scholars, and I could go off on this for a long time, but just to keep it as short as possible, most scholars recognize that Jesus is referring to this passage in Isaiah that has to do with the Jubilee, which is a canceling of debts and the setting free of prisoners. And it would be a mistake to somehow think that the prisoners he's talking about and the prisoners we're talking about are the same, but it'd also be a mistake to think that they're entirely different, because it's not as though we live in a harsher time exactly. You had people in jail for theft and for debt an awful lot, and for in conflicts of any sort. And so this idea of like, hey, after a time, everybody should be set free. There should be a divine Control-Alt-Delete to reset this, is very much a part of this vision of Jubilee, and it's a vision that Jesus appeals to. So at the very least, as people, if we're interested in what a Jesus-shaped response would be, I have to recognize that kind of the goal is a clearing away of debts, including these sort of criminal and civil debts, that people shouldn't be stuck to the past. And this has implications not only for us thinking about keeping people incarcerated, but it's also has a lot to do with maybe informing our vision of, which I'm going to talk about in a second. There's a word I'm thinking of. Shoot, I lost my train of thought. I'll get to it later. I know I'm going to get to it, so I'll just keep moving on. Another piece of this that I think is important, this comes from the wealth of liberation theologians, that it's not just a metaphor when we say Jesus is present with the crucified. There is a way that Jesus was George Floyd when George Floyd was murdered, and that's a matter of faith, that Jesus is present with the oppressed. And if that's true, it's an act of worship at some level to begin to to break the chains of bondage. And yes, the criminal justice system, we might recognize that sometimes people who deserve it get it, but the vast amount of people who are suffering and experience brutality and oppression that don't deserve it, clearly, should give us enough pause to think, okay, every time, this is very heavy-handed sounding, but every time we passively allow that to happen, we're allowing Jesus to be crucified again. Not in a good way, like when we're not in participating in the Eucharist sort of way, but in a horrific way. And we can't be passive on this. We have to do everything we can to stand in solidarity with those who are oppressed, even though it's complex. Like, even though we might not have the same responses to that, we can't just be passive in this when it's been brought to our attention, because Jesus is there. A third piece of this, the modern carceral system exists for largely two stated purposes. One is to punish those who commit crimes, and two is to rehabilitate them. And almost every study that's ever been done shows that number two doesn't work at all. And we know that number one is pretty punitive. And if we're going to go with the biblical witness here, God says, don't do vengeance. Vengeance is mine, I will repay. We shouldn't be about the vengeance business. At the very least, we should be shifting our emphasis away from punishment towards healing and transformation. That's the thing that our society needs, and we need to invest more in that. And we all know that our society invests disproportionately in militarism and punitive measures and violence. And so we have to counteract that. I mean, I think that's part of the mission of what the church exists for, is to bear witness to healing and transformation in the midst of an empire. A fourth one, we are to lean in towards love and not fear. Hospitality is an important biblical practice. And it's interesting, like, again, this conversation they're reading next door, the number of people who call the police, even in light of everything we know about how the police can respond towards people of color. I read all the time about someone saying, I saw a black man I saw this 3 weeks ago. I saw a black man wearing a hoodie out by my garage, hanging around the alley. I took pictures of him and I called the police. What should I do? Like, those sorts of statements are all the time. I'm like, do you not realize do you not know what happens to black men looking suspicious in hoodies? He's just suspicious. The only thing you know is that he's suspicious. And so what happens in our society is anything that's an inconvenience that we don't want to deal with, like loud neighbors or someone who's suspicious, we have no way of responding to those things proactively or communally. The idea, which I've suggested, is like, why don't you go to your neighbor and knock on their door? It's like, people just don't want to hear that. Why don't you take a few of your friends and go talk to the man in the alley? They just don't want to do that. Instead, we call the cops, who are there with a gun. And so part of, I think, the task, a spiritual task at the very least, is to start imagining, as churches, as these collectivities of healing and transformation, what does it mean for us to collectively respond to these sorts of challenges with love instead of fear? How do we encourage this? What does it look like to cast an imagination for that, to where we can learn to be neighborly and hospitable as a Christian practice, rather than calling the police every time there's something that just we don't like, which happens a lot. Spend the day reading next door, you'll be overwhelmed with sadness. And finally, this is the other piece. Given the history, and given, I think there's a strong case to be made throughout. There's a scriptural case to be made. There's a moral case to be made out apart from scripture, and there's definitely people making this case now in light of slavery that reparations and restitution are required. And given the nature of how policing has largely been used to oppress people of color, especially Black people and poor people, through its roots in slave patrolling and union busting, and its continued overemphasis on certain kinds of criminality that instead of the white collar variety, I think dealing with this is part of the task of doing reparations. We have to figure out how to keep inflicting increasing harm, and all these particularly young Black men disproportionately in prison for minor offenses, I think they are owed. They need restitution. And I think that begins by recognizing the system that caused the pain and caused the harm. So these are just some ways of beginning to think, okay, what does a spirituality that addresses policing look like? It looks at this Jubilee vision of liberation and being set free. It looks at the way that Christ is present among those who are being crucified, who are being harmed by state violence. It puts away vengeance and instead leans in towards healing. It leans away from fear and towards love. And then it recognizes the past hurt and seeks to make reparations and restitution as a form of repentance. Those are, I think, are some ways for us to begin to look at, okay, let's look at the history. Let's look at the proposals that are beginning to be on the table. Let's take these values and start being creative about what could it look like to move forward, both systemically as we talk to our council people, but also locally as we deal with neighbors who have loud music and we see someone lurking in our alleyways. So with that, I'm just gonna close it out for discussion. I see we have about 7 minutes of official time, and then like Monica said, I'm gonna be around till 8:30.
Thank you so much, Mark, for just for giving us so much to think about and for helping us to kind of pull together all these things that we're hearing from so many different sources. For me, this was a very concise explanation of the history of policing that is so important to know, as well as a really great brief overview of kind of what are the three things on the table. We've all heard reform, defund, and abolish. We hear them all used almost interchangeably, even though we all know that they're not interchangeable. And so thank you for helping us to get a better understanding of that. So I invite anybody who has questions for Mark in any capacity. As he signs up for this and knows our community, he knows that pretty much anything is fair game. So I think if you have any questions, I invite anybody to unmute themselves or put it into the chat and I can read it. So let's talk.
I see a couple comments in there from Rita about international examples that were brought up. I think is very helpful to think about, because we all know our system is not built up towards rehabilitation and healing at all. And so the example that is given there of the Norwegian system, which is more rehabilitation focused, I mean, I'd love to see. I think we can go farther than that, but man, if we could get there in my lifetime, that'd be a big win.
There are actually 3 states in the United States that are following the Norwegian perspective. I'm actually a part of a foundation that's funding some of those things. Oregon has implemented incarceration as rehabilitation, not as punishment. And the people who have benefited most from it are the prison guards. Their mental health has improved when they're treating the inmates as people, which shows respect. It's also decreased family violence at home because they feel better about the job that they're doing. So it's really interesting when you look at rehabilitation as opposed to punishment. It has more impact beyond. It has impact beyond just the prisoners. It also has impact on the prison guards.
That's good to hear. It's interesting. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Mark.
It's interesting when you start talking about this. Like, to me, the idea of rehabilitating someone is like obviously should be the goal, but it's amazing when you start talking to people, you start realizing how hard it is to get towards that, because, of course, there's the conservative politicians have their own reasons, but people really, really like vengeance a lot. The idea that someone could get away, that someone could kill someone and only serve 27 years of their life, no, they need to be dead. That kind of thinking is so ingrained that moving towards more of a therapeutic model, I think we've been so conditioned to really want to do not only an eye for an eye, but if you take one of my eyes, I'm going to take both of yours kind of mentality in our society.
And Paul Schnell, the Commissioner of Corrections here, has actually sent some staff to Oregon to see what they're doing in Oregon. So there's some hope.
Mark, others will correct me if I'm wrong, but on Facebook, it said that the Catholic Church has received X number billion or billions of dollars from the COVID, except, and the first thought comes to my mind, what is the church going to do with that?
Mm-hmm.
pay off the pedophile stuff. But after hearing what you're saying, what if the Catholic Church could help with reform, hiring social workers, etc., to do this, but have a source of funding other than the state? Because to me, what is the Catholic Church going to do with that money? With, I don't know, it's just a thought. And I didn't get there until you got to the reform part with Jesus. So I think it would be a good idea. So all you have to do is convince the Catholic Church how to spend it.
Is that all?
Yeah, that's all.
It's
But
interesting.
Interesting. And what a way to do something, a value.
I love the idea of.
I believe in the Catholic Church again. Right now it's questionable.
Mhm. I love the idea of churches putting their money where their mouth is.
Right.
Because we, like obviously our society has to do this as a government and as a people, like obviously, but like, churches, we talk about values, but we have more power to enact things than we think. Like I often hear, especially I have friends who are like in the Mennonite church, in like more of the Anabaptist world, where they think, oh, the government should be over there and the church should be over here. We do our own thing, and we should do justice. To heck with them. And I'll often ask them like why their churches never redistributed all of its wealth amongst themselves and to the poor, because that's like, why not? Right? If you want your government to be socialist, which a lot of people do, it's like, well, why not try to get the 74 people in that Baptist church who are suddenly progressive to start being a little bit socialist amongst themselves? Because at the very least, it opens up imagination for possibility and creates a demonstration plot of what's possible. And of course, we've seen that in the past with churches creating hospitals. Hospitality has been an off and on practice for churches. This is a way of extending hospitality. How do we begin to bring healing to places and situations where harm has been done? And policing is one of those. So that'd be amazing to start thinking about that. What does it mean to be a chaplain to the people who are like I've had friends who have been chaplains who've served ridden along with police officers, and they're mostly there for the police officers. But what about us, the church, being the chaplain to the not only people who are incarcerated in jail, but the people at risk of being punished by police violence? Like, how do we stand with them? I think it's a great question.
Mark, this is Dennis Coyne. Do you hear me?
I hear you.
When we talk about defund the police, it seems to me that we set up an oppositional confrontation, defund them. And so we are us and them. We just have been introduced, at least I have, to the Braver Angels model, where they really actually bring together the two sides of the disagreement or issue, and they, with respect, talk to each other. The question I have is there a model where the police and the community come together to talk about possible, what we have now described in this conversation as defunding? Or is it always oppositional? Are always the police on the defensive or in the respondent position?
I mean, it's complicated. I mean, this is where they get these, like, so the chief of police seems like he'd be more willing to have a conversation about this, but ironically has less power than the union, which does not want to have this conversation. So I think there are factions, which only complicates things. So, I mean, that's a good question. What does it look like to facilitate that? And, this maybe also falls into oppositional thinking, but as long as the police, the union, and the head of the union have so much power to thwart everything disproportionately, I don't think that conversation is going to be able to have much traction. So somehow we have to clear space for that to happen. But that's a good question. I'm a little more comfortable being oppositional than you are, but I do recognize I've had enough friends who were former police officers to know that a lot of police officers end up feeling stuck. And so I do have sympathy. because once you've been in it long enough, if you just opt out, you lose a lot of your pension and the things you've invested. So you do feel stuck that way. So the only people I've personally known who have left the police force were early in their careers because they felt that it was toxic to them. And at that point, they're not in a position to start having a conversation. So I think it's a difficult situation.
So Mark, you bring up a great point, and Mary has referenced it in the chat, and I have a note by it myself. Can you talk just a little bit about the police union? So I think it's safe to say that probably 99% of us on this call know that the police union is a problem, particularly the person who's currently head of the police union. But you talked briefly about how when the police union was formed back in the early 1900s, it had the option to kind of function like a traditional union at the time or become something different, and it became something different. Can you talk briefly about how that came about and kind of how the police union has become, as you already said, more powerful than the chief of police now?
Yeah, and this is, I mean, we're getting a little bit more outside of my area of, I haven't studied this a lot, but what I do know is, so there was pressure, I can't remember exactly the year, but it was in the earlier part of the 1900s, pressure from city leaders to say, you either, like this union stuff, like we don't like it, and you either have to pick the AFL or you pick us. And so they broke ranks with the AFL, and that's why they're not in solidarity with other unions. It's kind of this weird anomaly. And at that point, then the union started, this is a criticism conservatives make about unions all the time, but in this case, I think it's true that the union has a lot of power to not just negotiate, but they can basically force everyone to act as a block, to not break rank. Now, if you're talking about Amazon warehouse employees, I think that's generally a good idea. Like, you got to stand against management. But in this case, the police aren't working class people standing against management. They are a block of maybe working class law enforcement people standing against elected officials who represent the people. So we're the management in a way. And so all of a sudden, what normally is a very democratic thing, a union, has become an undemocratic thing, making it hard to hold them accountable. And so to this point where even, so Bob Kroll, when they started talking about this stuff, basically was sending letters on behalf, like he's in conversation with Donald Trump, doing basically a full reach around through the democratic process to get, like he wanted to have the National Guard brought in under his leadership. He was talking about this stuff, horrifically undemocratic, but he has the power to do that because the only way to get him out is to have the police vote him out. So it creates this very difficult situation where we can't really find ways to move forward until this is taken care of. And now it's, I mean, I don't know if you've been noticing, but it's gotten more complicated because 150 police officers all at once are filing for disability, which again, I have no doubt that there's trauma with being a police officer and it causes PTSD, but 150 people doing it at once to me sends a political message. So there's all kinds of foot dragging stuff that happens and the union protects them in a situation where they need to be a little bit more vulnerable to public sentiment and discussion before we can move forward.
Thank you.
I have one last question. Well, I don't know if it's the last question, but I have a question about, it seems to me that prison reform and now especially police reform is still a really hard sell to moderates I know, and like my family, for instance, or people I work with, teachers I work with. And I'm wondering what makes people that, it's almost like people that are considered in prison or quote unquote criminals, you know, are like at the bottom of who we should care about. And I'm really curious where that, do you have any insight on where that came from?
Well, I mean, I think there's part of it is a little bit of, there's definitely classism and racism that are in the mix, but there's also a healthy dose of propaganda. There's a reason why I know there's been a lot of outcry against ICE, but the idea that a certain kind of immigrant, a brown immigrant from south of the border, is particularly dirty and unsafe has a lot of traction. That's why we can have ICE as an agency. And so this mixture of fear and disgust gets stirred up. It's the idea, it's why like there's almost an intrinsic criminalization of being a loud black man on the street. So like if you're loud and black, the police will be called on you. I could go outside and yell on the street and they won't get called on me. So there's a lot of this propaganda gets built up on top of each other. And so then all of a sudden, whole groups of people who look and act a certain way are seen as less than. And, you know, they actually, you know, in the retreat I did with y'all, I talked about studies on disgust mechanisms and the medial prefrontal cortex and all that stuff. But actually, after a while, you lose the capacity to see the full humanity of these folks because you've been conditioned to see them as less than. And so you start building on that over decades, and here we are.
I thought that was a helpful opinion piece by Betsy Hodges, which to me the key part was the police are carrying out what white liberals want them to do, to set up a perimeter to keep our comfort and our property safe. And it's an unspoken contract, but it's very obvious. And the police know it and they live by it. And they say, what do you expect? Isn't that what you want us to do? So they're carrying out our white privilege. I felt that for a long time, that they're only doing what we want them to do. We don't want to do the dirty work. And so we say, let the police you know, worry about whatever that broken window thing was, or, you know, those initiatives that were to find crime and, you know, cut it to the bone. That's why they're in parks and why they're in schools and why they're in neighborhoods that are not so affluent.
I think it's important to name that. The police are the tip of the spear, but it's not that they're not just making this stuff up. We've told them to do stuff, and we tell them covertly and overtly all the time, and then when it's politically inopportune, we throw them under the bus. The police feel this very a lot. I'm sure they're feeling betrayed, and you know, we've been hearing about them dragging their feet about being called into certain neighborhoods as a way of showing how much we need them. A lot of that stuff happens because I think maybe even a little bit rightfully feel betrayed because they're asked to do one thing one year and the next year they're thrown under the bus. And so it just shows that the problem is much more than just the police, that we're all at some level complicit whenever we've been willing to let someone else be harmed for our comfort.
Yeah, go ahead.
Say, Mark, you know, I think we've learned that the training that our police force is done at Fort Ripley. That's our military base in Fort Ripley right here. And to me, that's a real concrete place to intervene, re-educate, and say maybe that's not the best context to train our police force. And way back when Chief Bob Olson was the mayor, I remember there was a group, and I remember saying, why do we use the military base up here in Camp Ripley to police? They're militarized right from the beginning by using that training. So I was in hopes that we could start real close to home here in Minnesota to say we're gonna have it almost like an intervention. And I mean, you have to learn how to defend yourself and all of that within reason. But I wondered if you could help us not see that we have this right in our face and in our hands, that's where we train the militarization of our police force here. So can you address that? If we could do something about we, the citizens of Minnesota could do something about that intervention with that?
Ripley?
I think, yeah. I mean, it'd be interesting to start wondering about what it looks like to organize, the School of the Americas has had a presence over here because of their training of people, right? So like, what's a small School of the Americas resistance look like for our homegrown version of that? I mean, this ties in because, they get, like maybe, I think it's in North Dakota, there's a lot of training for using drones, like military training for using drones in police departments. We've sent our police to Israeli trained, basically militarization training, which, is tied directly into the oppression of the Palestinians. So all this stuff is connected, but the idea that there's something close by at home, militaristic training, it seems like a great place to start thinking, okay, there's so much to do, but this is the homegrown piece that's nearby that we can respond to and begin to have a faithful presence to say, like, we need to stop treating our own people as though that this is a war zone. And we got to stop training our police to be basically militarized, to be military against the most vulnerable in our society. And this is a place to start. I think that's a beautiful suggestion. And now I'm going to be thinking about it. Yeah.
Well, we have some citizenship power already in place here.
Mm-hmm.
I can't name the people, but it feels like we have already a strong kernel of local citizens that know how to mobilize this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So one thing that's weighing, Jane, I love how I love your commitment to action. I love that, that in this, that comes out. So Mark, one thing that's really weighing on my head is I want to be for the abolition of the police.
Mm-hmm.
I want to be for the end to this system that has come out of racial oppression and was built specifically to keep the poor and people of color, Black men, down. However, the idea of completely abolishing the police as a whole is really scary to me.
Sure. Yeah.
And so I think that's a question that I have. So how do we, because that sounds really great, but tangibly, how does that actually happen? Specifically, you can't just completely obliterate everything all at once, or can you? Or, how do you see that really working, the action steps towards abolition?
I think this is why the defund piece is so important. And it does allow people to be brought together, whether they're more of a reformist or an abolitionist, is to start saying, like, look, we should not be shackled to a charter that requires a certain number of police officers per capita. And we should not have to have something that does these functions exactly the way it's mandated. We need the freedom to start saying, let's look at this as a public health issue, start addressing the core issues, and then also, like, we're not, I have even the abolitionists that I talk to, none of them are saying, like, they're all going to recognize that, at least for the foreseeable future, we're going to end up with something like a police force. But we need the freedom to start reapportioning things based upon what's the best way to deal with the actual problem. And so to me, that's what the defund movement does, is say, okay, we need to take a step back and say, if we were looking at the problems now from scratch without the weight of 150 years of the Minneapolis Police Department, what would we design based on the best practices around the world for addressing all these problems with the city budget that we have? And how much of that really has to be done by armed men and women responding, to things? And that really only goes down to violent situations, which already they can't even respond to those very well. Like, we've been hearing about shootings all over, like, been hearing about shootings in Uptown and the police don't show up on time. That's a great example of, like, well, I don't like them going in there and shooting anybody, but if you're gonna have a police force that has guns, you should at least not have them bogged down dealing with tenant disputes. so that the people that are trained specifically for dealing with violent situations can respond quickly and not be bogged with 812 other tasks. So that's, to me, is the defund thing. And then within that are going to be people like me who are like saying, how far can we push this so we don't have anybody with a gun? Nobody sees the police. And we're going to push that as hard as we can, but at the end of the day, know that violence exists in our society, and our society is not going to tolerate not having something like a police force in the mix. That's kind of how I look at it.
So where do you see the people who are currently in the police force? Where do you see them fitting into an abolished structure, do you think?
I personally think most of them are going to have to, are going to be unemployed. Like,
Find a new job.
yeah, and if any of them who can get trained and do stuff, like this happens anytime an industry dies out. Like I would love for the police industry to die out, and it's sad that they wouldn't have the job, but I would be more happy that they don't have to be in a job that dehumanizes themselves and others. So, but there's enough, a lot of the police department aren't officers on the ground, and a lot of the people that are officers on the ground have different kinds of training. So I think there is places where if they're not not called to respond to a crisis situation with a gun, they could probably have other things that they could do within a public health response system. But that's one of the big questions that gets thrown out. Like, well, we don't even know how to answer that question until we start even knowing what questions to ask before it, really.
Reminder, oh, there we go, okay. It's like I see some people talking, but remember to unmute yourself before you ask your.
I was going to say, I don't know if I'm hearable or not. Okay, thanks,
We
Monica.
can hear you.
Okay. To me, one of the most powerful presentations, along with this one, and thank you very much, was a presentation put on by the St. Paul East Side, what's it called?
Freedom Library?
Library. Yeah, last week. It was a presentation by 3 Minnesota authors, and it was called The Roots of Racism in Minnesota. And Bill Green, who's a professor at Augsburg, has a new book out. And the other 2 men, I can't remember their names, but one came through, his whole presentation was about the idea of land and property and how white people, European people came in and imposed the idea of private property on this land that was for years, eons, taken care of by the notion of, by most indigenous cultures, of this spiritual relationship and stewardship. And then the other man was talking about slavery and also the unions and employment issues. And I don't remember their names offhand, but it was a presentation for about an hour last week. And it was just marvelous. And it just kept underscoring over and over again the complexity and that there's hardly any issue in our society, public health, housing, education, policing, anything, criminal justice, that isn't all interconnected. And it's most of it is, power over somebody else. And that how sort of gets back to, I think, the roots of what you're talking about, Mark, is just the complexity. But yet we have to, and I'm really encouraged by what you're saying, we have to start thinking about other ways of doing it and have the freedom. As you're talking about the charter, it's helped me think about that a little bit clearer. We need to have the freedom to think about other ways. We don't have to mandate X number of people per, or X number of policemen per citizen, etc. So I would just encourage people to go back into YouTube or in Facebook and listen to that presentation. It was just marvelous. So I just wanted to share that. And again, thank you very much for this presentation.
Thank you for sharing about that. And is that a presentation? Is it on the Eastside Freedom Library's website? Do you know?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It's called The Roots of Racism in Minnesota. Yeah. Thank you.
Is there maybe one more question for Mark before we wrap up?
Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
This isn't a question, it's just a comment about what needs to be put in place. Of course, I think it will take a long time, but rerouting money so that offenders are given comprehensive testing for like mental health, physical health, literacy, types of schooling they've had and how they can complete programs, how they can get training, because they come out and they don't have jobs if they can ever get out. They don't have that capacity. If they've been felons, it's like a life kiss of death on them to find a job. But I think that's one of the things that Norway does. It does comprehensive testing. And so they look for where they need to intervene. And the other thing they do is they build community with community. And those are missing things.
Mm-hmm. It's a good word. My father-in-law, who's now passed, he was an ex-convict. That's how he met my mother-in-law. She was a nurse volunteer at the Stillwater prison, and so I grew up like I met my wife when we were 14, and we got married when we were 21. So I almost grew up with Bob. It was almost like my father. But he would talk all the time about the stigma of being an ex-convict.
Oh, awesome.
For 3.5 years for armed burglary, which would be more now if you were arrested for it, and how it just never left. Like it limited his job choices. It's kind of, it reminds me of the way that a lot of Republicans talk about abortion, and then at the same time they stigmatize unwed mothers, as though like that those aren't cross purposes, that you're going to just shame them no matter what happens.
Yeah, they haven't paid for welfare.
Yeah. So if we're gonna like make it easier for people to be to actually be reformed through the prison system, we can't keep punishing them after it, especially things like restoring the right to vote. All these things, it doesn't make sense that this is still even a topic at this point in our society, that we still have to talk about these things.
This is truly, I think, a beautiful and powerful group of people that I see in front of me today. And I hope that you all feel that as well. Mark, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today and to make this opportunity happen for all of us. I want everybody to know that Mark has waived his honorarium, and he will be, we will be providing, usually adult ed, we pay our speakers for their time, and he has elected to waive that, and he will be sending it instead to one of the organizations he's already mentioned, led by people of color working for police reform. So very happy to be supporting him in that as well, and to be a part of that. I do want to direct you, I put a survey link in the chat. Adult education, we'd really like to hear from you about how this program went, and then obviously we will share it with Mark as well if you have any feedback for him. I will be sending out the link to this recording so that you can share it with others or listen to it again with fresh ears or whatever you'd like, as well as Mark's PowerPoint and the outline that we have. Lastly, I would like to remind you or tell you about the next opportunity Adult Ed is providing is on the 4th Tuesday of the month. So that is, I think, July 28th. Yep, July 28th, we will have another adult ed program, and this will be led once again by Braver Angels that Dennis mentioned and that many of you are familiar with. They work across the red-blue divide, and this will be a skills workshop for having peace-building conversations and conversations across just with people who are different and who think differently, right? So it's a great opportunity. The first one that we had last month was very well received. So this will be another opportunity to learn something new, but still participate in that. So I think that's everything. Thank you all again so much for being here with us tonight. Yes, please fill out your survey. And if you have any questions, concerns, please let me know. You can send me an email. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, Nell.
Thanks for having me.